Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November something. What is it? The 17th. And we will hear Climate Resilience and Housing Collaborating for Success. For content questions related to the presentation, just type those in your Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end during the designated Q&A. If you have technical questions, again, type them in the Q&A box. Ooh, that's interesting. And I will do my best to answer those as I see them. Up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2023. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Virginia chapter of APA. So thanks for joining the consortium. You've been a longtime friend to us and for bringing this important session to us today. We have one webcast left for 2023. It's a good one. It's hosted by the technology division. Everything that they seem to push out seems to be super pertinent and timely. So I highly recommend that you register for this webcast on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And I already have my calendar booking open and we have sessions booking already for 2024. So stay tuned. In the next couple weeks, we'll get those up here so that you can register. Today's session is worth 1.5 AICP CM credits and one of the Sustainability and Resilience credits. To log your credits, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search either by the title or the event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. If there are any new webinars for you to register for, things like that, I'll post up there. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll get notified when we have a new recording available, as we record all of our sessions and post them up there. If you just search Planning Webcast on YouTube, we'll pop up. And we have well over 450 session recordings available for free. So again, if you have any questions, either technical questions for me or content questions for our presenter, type them in that Q&A box. We don't raise hands, we don't have voices, you just need to type them in and we'll get to those at the end during our Q&A period. Okay, so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn it over to you, Danielle, to kick things off. We actually had a great pre-discussion about all things affordable housing and aging populations and all the things. So hopefully I've got her all primed up and ready and we can have a great discussion today. So your screen looks great and you are
Perfect.
good to go.
All right. Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here with you all. I'm a lapsed APA and AICP person, so I really feel like I'm among my people, given the work that I've been doing and the planning degrees that I have. So really happy to be here with you all today to talk about this important topic. And I'll preface it by saying it's a little bit of a mashup between two talks that I give, but I think you'll see the synergies between them. And I hope that in one or both, you'll find things that are very relevant to your work. I certainly think that it's relevant to all that we face as a country right now. Just for context, I'm currently the Managing Director for Policy at National Housing Trust. Prior to that, I was Director of Livable Communities at AARP for 5 years, and before that, held positions in HUD and in EPA at the national level. I live in Arlington, Virginia, so shout out to AARP Virginia for, or rather APA Virginia for putting me forward for this, especially Jillian Saul and Andrew Hopewell. And just a little bit about who I work for now. National Housing Trust is a national nonprofit. We develop and manage affordable housing for about 4,000 families in the Mid-Atlantic largely. But we also do a lot of policy work, which is what I lead, where we're trying to bring climate benefits into affordable housing. We know that not only do we need to preserve the existing housing stock that we've got, but we really need to make that that housing stock as resilient to the climate changes that we face as possible. So excited to bring some of that work to you all today. So the first part of my talk will really kind of dive in on the affordable housing crisis, and then I'll kind of pivot halfway through to really a little bit of a deeper dive on aging and climate resilience, which is the nexus of the book that I wrote, which I'll talk more about. But first, just to kind of set the stage on the affordable housing crisis, which I think is a great jumping off point to talk about some of these challenges. I would wager that all of you in your communities are struggling with this notion of how to provide enough and um, the right kind of affordable housing for your folks. There are estimates that we're undersupplied by anywhere from 5.5 to about 7 million homes in terms of being able to satisfy what is truly needed, particularly for the lowest income households. There's a true lack of affordable housing across every corner of the US. It is now the case, as reported by National Low Income Housing Coalition in their fantastic Out of Reach report, that there's now no county in the US where someone can earn minimum wage and afford a 2-bedroom rental at market rate. That wasn't always the case. There used to be a few pockets, but no longer. The housing affordability crisis really stretches across the entire state. There are, of course, resources available to provide more affordable housing, but without exception, they are oversubscribed and insufficient. We see waiting lists for housing choice vouchers, previously called Section 8, which let people move with their subsidy into housing. Those waiting lists are quite long. When we think about what new capital is needed to build more affordable housing, some of the efforts that were made in prior federal legislation, like Build Back Better, to really bump up the investment and federal investment in affordable housing, those failed. And there really isn't likely to be another federal infusion at the kind of scale that we need. And low-income housing tax credits, which are the nation's largest source of funding for affordable housing. Interestingly, it's not programs that come out of HUD, it is these tax credits that come out of Treasury. Those tax credits are oversubscribed, and the bond cap that's needed for implementation of the 4% credits is maxed out in many states. And what that means is that there's just greater and stiffer competition for the few resources that do exist to invest in affordable housing. We know that as a result of the pandemic, it really revealed the importance of emergency rental assistance, which was a kind of a short-term, time-limited infusion from the federal government. It was wildly successful at keeping people housed along with eviction moratoriums. And it exposed the need for us to really create reserves for people to navigate difficult and unexpected financial crises. Adding to the challenge here is that building costs continue to rise. National Association of Realtors reported that the average building costs for a single family home increased 42% from 2018 to 2021. And even in our work at National Housing Trust, we are really challenged to deliver affordable housing at reasonable rates. One of our most recent properties ended up costing $700,000 per door for modest but nice affordable housing development here in DC. For all these reasons, homelessness continues to surge, and that's really very closely associated with the lack of supply and difficulty building housing, particularly in high growth locations. Around 600,000 people are currently unhoused in 2022. And at present, about half of those folks live in 4 states. 25 to 40%, and I should say those states are California, New York, Florida, and Washington. A good share of those, between a quarter and about 40%, are not part of a family and have substance use disorder. But what's surprising now, I think, is that single adults over 50 make up half of the homeless population. About a quarter of people who are unhoused are families. Nearly 40% of the homeless population is women or girls. So we have this pretty dire situation across the country. And that's borne out, I think, in some of the figures and indices, if you will, that we see coming out that really reveal the story of what housing costs are. On the left chart here, you'll see that the yellow bar, it looks at the sort of the red line is an index of home prices across the country. The yellow bar is meant to indicate the growth year to year. And you'll see that with a couple dips, there's been pretty steady growth such that the home price index now is as high as it's ever been. It's leveled off for the moment, but I'm certain that rocky roads are ahead still. And rentals as well, you see that the sheer number of apartments, I should say rentals generally, low cost rentals has declined when you look at those lower priced units. So the left hand bars is units under $600, $600 to $800. From 2011 to 2021, the supply for each of those has dipped, whereas the supply of higher price rentals continues to rise. And I'll cite, great work out of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies in their most recent housing report for that data. So we know that when people are unable to secure affordable housing, there's a whole bunch of sort of byproducts that come with that. They pay larger shares of their limited income for rent, meaning that other needs like education, healthy food, medical care are delayed or unmet. And when communities as a whole fail to secure affordable housing, entire communities can be displaced. It becomes increasingly challenged to grow economically if you can't provide enough affordable housing. Eviction is obviously the most extreme indicator of lack of affordable housing, and it really speaks to the impacts. I think I'll cite again the work here of Matthew Desmond and the Eviction Lab, which hopefully y'all are very well familiar with. They brilliantly describe what it means to not have secure housing, what eviction can lead to in terms of the downward spiral of instability that it causes. People don't fall up into better housing, they fall down into worse housing, which begets then greater health crises, more missed school, most work. And this dynamic we have seen repeatedly disproportionately impacts single mothers and people of color. So really locking in and being able to hone in on housing stability and affordability is an incredibly key part, incredibly important part of ensuring that we can build that upward mobility from poverty. I want to take a little bit of a side road for a moment just to talk about what affordable housing means for older adults, and I'll circle back to this in a few minutes. But older adults are not immune to this housing crisis either. There will be a new report coming out in about 10 days from Harvard that examines housing from the perspective of older adults, which I'm looking forward to. But looking back to prior reports, what we see is that it's a pretty dire picture for older adults as well. Households at retirement age that were paying more than 30% of their income for housing reached an all-time high in their last report. I'm certain that that is still the case for this year. And it was projected to swell even further, particularly as the share of very low-income households is expected to rise. Another report, the Administration for Community Living Profile of Older Adults, put that in very real terms. We have about 14 million households that are headed by a person 75 or older. Of those, nearly a half are housing cost burdened. And among renters, that swells to 3/4. So those are, of course, folks who are paying more than 30% of their income just on housing alone. We'll talk a little bit about what this means when we couple that with utility costs and insurance costs, but know that housing already is a challenge for many older adults. Of course, housing doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is both a contributor to climate change and a crucial part of how we continue to adapt to climate change. So first, let's kind of unpack what climate mitigation means from a housing perspective. It's estimated that about 20% of our carbon emissions come from the residential sector. That comes from the energy utilized to heat and cool homes, the energy required to construct the homes, the material used, and to support the infrastructure for those homes. It doesn't include the transportation emissions that go with that, nor the waste that's generated from homes. So that when you think about all that together, it's a pretty significant slice of the pie in a world where we're trying to cut emissions. We know that driving better results in new construction, therefore, when we're bringing new housing online, we have to really do that with a mind to bringing down carbon emissions and thinking about climate mitigation. There are, of course, lots of opportunities to do that, both in the form of housing that we create, whether we're creating single-family detached homes, single-family attached homes, or multifamily homes. And it's also incredibly important when we think about the level of environmental performance that we expect. What this table shows is it maps those three different interventions, frankly. What are the energy consumption requirements, or how much energy is consumed per unit in a single family detached home that is built conventionally? That's those dark black and gray lines on the left-hand side. And then it compares again, as well as units that are built in those same forms using green building features, South Base, Enterprise, Green Communities, LEED, any of the standards that are out there. All of those, when you bring them to housing, will also deliver better energy savings, more climate benefits. And then again, at the bottom, you'll see CSD and TOD. Connections to transportation, we know, makes a huge difference in terms of energy consumption. a green home built in a conventional suburban development is not going to perform even as well as a non-green home built accessible to transit. And so I think when we look at how do we bring down emissions associated with all the different options in front of us when it comes to housing, we can see that the least consumptive types of housing are ones that are transit oriented, that are green, and that are single family attached or multifamily. And even without green features, even a conventional development that doesn't include a single, Energy Star appliance is still going to perform better if it's transit oriented and multifamily. And again, when we think about what it's really going to take to bring down carbon emissions from housing, we need to keep all of these elements and aspects in mind. And that's really important because we know that we are going to, or that we already are, facing increasing climate risks. So as we think about not just mitigating climate effects, but adapting to our new climate future, how and where we build makes a big difference. Hopefully you all have seen this before. This is a frequent go-to visual for me. NOAA updates this on a monthly basis, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, to count and quantify and display the number of billion-dollar events that we've had as a country. These are events that cause more than $1 billion of damage in our country, and they really run the gamut from heat waves to flooding to severe weather to wildfire. For many decades, our average was about 8 of these events per year. Last year, we had 18. This year, we're at 25, and we still have a few more days in hurricane season. So this clearly illustrates that we are already living in a situation of more frequent, more intense disasters, and likely will be facing that in our future as well. And the harsh truth, the sad truth, really is that those who can least afford to bear the burdens of these climate changes that we're seeing are those who are at greatest risk. This is true demographically, as I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's certainly true for affordable housing, which is the focus of our efforts here at National Housing Trust, and why we need to, I think, prioritize affordable housing as part of the housing solution. Disproportionately affordable units, even and especially those supported by HUD, are at risk. Disproportionate low-income households spend more on utilities and are challenged to balance the rising cost of utilities relative to their rent costs. So this is the byproduct of not only racist land use policies over many years, but frankly, the cost of land is cheaper in riskier locations. And when affordable housing developers are trying to make deals pencil, they end up oftentimes selecting locations in more risky areas. What we see nationally is that the risk to affordable housing units is going to more than triple over the next 30 years. There's a report that we partnered with Climate Central to do, which demonstrates that by 2050, nearly all coastal states will have affordable housing stock that will be exposed to more than one coastal flood risk event per year. That's up from about half of the states in 2000. It's an incredible equity issue as well. We know that 43% of the HUD-assisted households of color live in areas with very high or relatively high risk of natural hazards, compared to 28% of those same households who are white. So really thinking about and focusing in on what does climate resilience mean for affordable housing has to be an incredibly important part of our adaptation strategy. I'll take another side journey for just a second to focus on older adults. It may not be surprising that older adults also are at increased risk. What we see with a great report from Climate Central is that there's been a near doubling of the population of people 65 and older in areas that are going to be most frequently impacted by storms and flooding. Those states being Florida, Texas, New Jersey, and others. In Florida, we see that one of the metrics that Climate Central mapped was the number of nursing home beds that were in areas of risk of flooding. And Florida is right in the bullseye on that, as you might imagine, with the 2/3 increase in the number of nursing home beds that will be exposed to storms or flooding going forward. So thinking about all of that, I think it's worth pausing to paint a picture of what resilient housing might look like. And this applies to both conventional and affordable housing. Some of the strategies that we need to be promoting and embracing are certainly, smaller homes that require less energy to heat and cool and maintain, particularly attached and multifamily units. More homes with energy efficiency features that conserve energy, which is a mitigation strategy, and allow us to better adapt to changing weather conditions. Climate resilient homes also plan for and account for the most extreme conditions in their design with backup power and fortified roofs and windows and design elements and materials that acknowledge the risk and take steps accordingly. Location also matters. Getting homes out of harm's way and concentrating development in areas that are higher prone and less prone to flooding and away from the coast to mitigate storm surges is critically important, as is more interstitial things like long-term affordability and location in walkable communities. All of these sort of elements come together to really address both the mitigation challenges that we've got and the adaptation ones. So what I'd like to do is just take a minute to kind of paint a picture a little bit with a little more detail of what that looks like at the building scale, which is where the developers like National Housing Trust has an ability to incorporate elements into our design, particularly around affordable housing, but also what are those corollary opportunities at the community scale that planners are in the best position to leverage. When we think about flooding, both at the community and the building scale, we need to be thinking about drainage systems and stormwater policies and levees and green infrastructure. At the building scale, that looks like better site drainage and wet and dry flood-proofing properties, backwater valves and pumps. From the building and design and materials perspective, at the community scale, we will be better served with more incentives for green building certifications of the types that I've mentioned here, as well as decarbonization and energy efficiency investments. At the building scale, when owners or developers are achieving those standards through these investments and these practices, that's going to deliver us a better and more resilient affordable housing stock. From the utilities perspective, at the community scale, investments in community solar and providing incentives for renewable energy and customer-friendly programs by utilities all lend themselves to a better environment for climate resilience. And at the building scale, that looks like rooftop solar or community solar, use of geothermal, and certainly more energy efficiency and weatherization. When we think about what systems are needed for this, at the community scale, that's thinking about how we ensure a resilient grid, how we locate critical facilities, how we can ensure key transportation networks are supported. And again, at the building scale, thinking about systems there, that means lifting up, elevating systems that might be at risk from flooding and ensuring that there's backup power or storage. Zoning changes are the unique purview of community scale actors like planners. We know that by encouraging more multifamily housing, single family attached homes, and ADUs, all of those roll up to a more resilient community at the end of the day. And certainly then the social infrastructure that sort of wraps around all of these hard elements of communities, creating effective networks and better communications and shelters at the community scale can augment what should happen at the building scale, which is use of resilience hubs, better communication, and better engagement of residents in what it means to prepare for a climate future. So how do we get there? Well, the good news is there's a lot of housing agencies that are already starting to recognize the importance of reducing emissions and driving better environmental performance and creating healthier homes in their allocation, particularly of low-income housing tax credit resources. And I'm really happy to share, we just at National Housing Trust released these set of info briefs, as we're calling them, which examine the rule book that state agencies use for investing in affordable housing. And we see that nearly all of them now are incentivizing the use of green building standards to improve energy performance. Many more are doing that than in 2020. And that we're seeing more of these state agencies encourage things like electrification in affordable housing. So these are incremental steps. It's not going to solve everything, but knowing that housing agencies and the investments in affordable housing are pushing us in that direction is an incredibly important step forward. The other good news is that this is an unprecedented time for federal support for this work now. And so I'll do a quick overview here and then do a little bit of a touchdown on a few of the programs that we see at National Housing Trust as being really critically important to advancing these kinds of solutions that I've talked about. So before IRA, we had things like FEMA's BRIC program, which invests in community resilience, hazard mitigation plans, and HUD's mitigation and disaster recovery grants. For many years, we've had weatherization and LIHEAP support, which brings down the cost of energy for low-income households. A couple of years ago, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, also called IIJA, we saw an expansion of LIHEAP and weatherization grants. We saw more investment in electric grid resilience, certainly better investment in climate mapping, which we're really seeing the fruits of now, and greater focus on coastal resilience. But I would say the big kahuna was when the Inflation Reduction Act passed a little more than a year ago, and that set in place several programs that are going to be directly relevant and directly able to drive different outcomes in housing as well as in other sectors. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that HUD launched this really exciting pro-housing program to incentivize zoning reform. That's underway now, but I think things like that are all signals that the federal government is trying to drive better decisions at the local level. So I'll just quickly touch on a couple of these programs. EPA, there's a $27 billion fund that is being designed at this very moment. Applications are in. We're all awaiting to hear the decisions from EPA, but that's going to unleash billions of dollars of funding to address greenhouse gas reduction. We are very excited that we believe that the National Clean Investment Fund will ultimately provide new resources that can be driven into multifamily affordable housing. And we're particularly excited about the Solar for All programs that will launch in every state, which support the construction of particularly community solar that can then be used to offset and sometimes serve as direct bill credits for low-income households, thereby bringing down the cost of utilities for them and putting more people in reach of renewable sources of energy. Another program that is really exciting, and this is one that we advocated for specifically, is HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. This is relatively small in IRA world. It's just $1 billion, but it's hugely meaningful. And this is the only program being administered by HUD from IRA that will directly retrofit existing buildings, and it, in some cases, supports new building as well. So these funds go directly into affordable housing. They are aiming to up the environmental performance and the resilience of affordable housing developments, and they provide real money to get things done that developers otherwise would struggle to provide. I'll share in a couple of minutes one of the awards that we were lucky enough to receive and what that means for us. A couple other resources, very briefly, are the rebate programs that are coming out of Department of Energy. There's two different flavors of this. One is to offset the cost of appliances. So, heat pump HVAC, heat pump water heaters. There are incentives, and now there are even requirements to ensure that these rebates are reaching low-income households, and particularly low-income multifamily households. That is the result of advocacy by us and others, so that these rebates actually reach the people who need it the most. It doesn't just flow to higher-income single-family residents. Another flavor of these rebates is to bring down the energy use for the unit as a whole. And again, there are incentives built into this to better serve low-income households, disadvantaged communities, and we are really pleased again that there's a set aside in here to ensure that these rebates reach places where low-income households live, particularly multifamily households. So I'll give a quick paint a quick picture of how we approach this work in our portfolio. We have about 34 properties. These are 3 of them. They're all in DC. Liberty Place on the left-hand side is a LEED Gold certified. This is the place that costs $700,000 a door to construct. It's difficult. It's not easy work, but it is possible. Savannah Apartments is an existing property that we acquired that we incorporated a community room, which we're looking to build out into a resilience hub. We've got a green roof. We've got great stormwater drainage on site, high-performing mechanicals in the building, and more. And a new development that we are midway building right now, Congress Heights, which sits right on top of Metro. I'm really happy to say, which will be Enterprise Green Communities Plus performance, a very high level of environmental performance when we're done. I'll also, pat ourselves in the back. We achieved our Better Buildings Challenge goals of reducing our portfolio-wide energy consumption by 20% over 10 years. We achieved that finally this year, and we seek to continue to work towards bringing down our emissions through better climate challenge commitments going forward. So I mentioned that we were very lucky to receive a leading edge award from HUD in the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. And also Andrew wanted me to include an example from Virginia. So here's one. This is a property that we own in Fredericksburg. It's a 147 unit development. We've owned it for several years. It needs a lot of investment. It needs a lot of upgrading and repair. There were gas leaks a few years ago that were not our fault, that led to the service being cut off. And what we had intended to do was upgrade this property. It was due for resyndication, but the receipt of this Green and Resilient Retrofit Award will allow us to electrify systems, to get renewable energy in there, and ultimately we hope to achieve the goal of achieve the certification of Gold Plus through the Net Zero Energy designation. So these federal investments do make the difference and are making the difference for residents of affordable housing now and in real time. I want to switch gears a little bit now, and I'm speeding through these a little bit so we have time for questions, but I kind of want to pivot now to looking at how all of these elements and more are relevant when we think about our demographics. As was mentioned at the top, I wrote a book called Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation, really spurred by this question that I increasingly was feeling a little preoccupied with, which was this intersection of these two trends that we see. So zooming back out a little bit to look at some kind of mega trends, we've touched on a lot of, several conditions already that make older adults more vulnerable. Things like the high rate of housing cost burden, population growth in states at risk of coastal flooding, and more. But those are really just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. If you recall, we had $25 billion disaster so far this year. What we see is that the conditions that older adults and all of us are living in really do run the gamut. We are facing more wildfires, storms, flooding, hurricanes, cold waves, and droughts. They reach nearly all corners of our country and not just the coastlines. And time again, we see that the events of this scale lead to the loss of life and the devastation of homes that will take communities many years to recover from. And the reason that it's so important to focus on the intersection of these two trends is not just because older adults will also be disproportionately impacted, but because older adults are the fastest growing demographic in the US. Together, these two trends, climate change and our aging nation, are certain to have a tremendous impact in how our communities function and how we need to plan for our future. We are, as a country, becoming older. 100 years ago, 1 in 20 of us was over 65. Today, 1 in 6 is, and in short order, it'll be 1 in 5. By 2034, there'll be more people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. And that group will be increasingly diverse, with far higher growth rates among non-white populations than white older adults. Altogether, it represents a significant tipping point among a sizable share of our population, but one that frankly doesn't get the kind of media coverage that I think it deserves. And because we aren't talking about it, there's really very little understanding in general of what that demographic shift means. Part of the challenge is in understanding this demographic shift is that there's no clear definition of who an older adult is. Is it when you get the ARP membership card at 50? Is it when you qualify for the 55 plus retirement community? Or when you start collecting Social Security, Medicare, or 62, 67, or something else entirely? We have a poor understanding of who older adults are because older adults also, because they continue to break the mold of what it means to be an older adult. We see people running the New York Marathon in their late 80s. We had Martha Stewart grace the cover of Sports Illustrated this year. Older adults continue to defy expectations and stretch the boundaries of what it means to age. But there are some inherent truths to aging when you look across the cohort as a whole. 1 in 6 live in poverty. 96% live independently outside of congregate facilities. And almost 30% live alone. 20% don't drive, and 1 in 9 live with dementia. 20% need help with activities of daily living, things like seeing, hearing, communicating, and self-care. And 40% have ambulatory limitations. It's a shortfall for all of us planners when we fail to acknowledge these realities and use them to guide how we design our communities. So we have these two big trends underway that I've talked about, and each of them has their own set of institutions that works to address them. We've got engineers and data analysts and climatologists and emergency managers thinking about what it means to plan for the impacts of climate. On the other side, you've got gerontologists and demographers, healthcare professionals, and aging advocates planning for an older, grayer future. That division of labor is often mirrored in state and local agencies that are similarly siloed. One set to regulate and manage public works and regulate utilities and manage emergency response, and another one entirely charged with promoting health and healthy aging. And I think therein lies the rub. We've got these two siloed approaches that are responsible for tackling incredibly complex challenges without a full understanding of how they intersect. This happens at the federal level, the state level, and even at the hyperlocal level. But I think planning offices can, and sometimes do, play a role at this intersection, but that needs to happen more often. As a result of these silos, there's too little attention paid to the intersection between climate risks and our aging population. And there's not enough focus, certainly, on how and where climate change exacerbates risk for older adults and what that means for communities that are home to an increasingly large share. The consequences of this siloed approach to climate change and aging become very clear when you look at who dies in climate-fueled disasters, where older adults predictably bear the brunt. Certainly that is the case for the largest named disasters, the one that occupy our collective memory. Katrina, California Camp Fire, the heat domes that covered the Pacific Northwest, Winter Storm Uri, and most recently, the Lahaina wildfires. For nearly 2 decades, hurricanes, winter storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures claim a far greater share of older adults' lives relative to the fact that they represent about 20% of the people, of the population. Older adults die at double, triple, or quadruple the rate as people who are younger. And the fact that this trend line is virtually unchanged over 20 years makes it painfully clear that we are failing to create communities that safeguard older adults in their time of greatest need. It's not like we haven't been told this was happening. There are news stories almost consistently that report on this tragedy, but we haven't made it a commitment to reverse this trend and solve this problem. So it certainly caused me to wonder, what can we do about it? How can we turn the tide on these dual trends that compound risks for older adults, making them more vulnerable? For me, I felt I could make a contribution by diving deep into the topic and ultimately sharing my perspective in a book called Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. Drawing lessons learned throughout my planning career and even more learned during my year of research, I finally landed on 3 big takeaways that I think start to pave the way to solutions. First, we have to be clear-eyed in our understanding about how climate change is impacting older adults and accept that in many cases they are being impacted more greatly. This has to start with a commitment to understanding who older adults are and what their needs are. Imagine the difference between a healthy, engaged, financially secure 62-year-old and an 89-year-old living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical challenges and no savings, or a grandparent who lives comfortably in an intergenerational home with her child and her family, compared to one who's caretaking for an adult child with a disability or a spouse with dementia. Older adults are a varied group in ages and abilities, and more racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse every year. Understanding the daily realities of older adults, their financial well-being and health, their caregiving responsibilities, their mobility challenges, and more, and how those intersect with climate risks becomes essential foundational work. Second, we need to recognize that individual and even institutional preparedness is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from my research is that these tragic lives lost aren't often the result of a failure of individuals to prepare. More often, they're a result of unrealistic expectations about what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who can't drive. They are also the result of systems-wide failures that impact the whole community, but especially older adults, and therefore must be dealt with at the community scale. Third, these and other reasons are why we need to lean into community-wide resilience. That means that all sectors and all disciplines have a role to play. Emergency managers, housing advocates and transportation planners, healthcare providers, utilities, and many more. This is no longer a job for any one sector or profession. It is a job for all of us. Furthermore, I believe that it is the job for all of us. After all, we all have older adults in our lives whom we love, and we all presumably hope to live in a community ourselves someday where we will be safe and secure in the face of a changing climate. We are not on a path at the moment to create such communities, so we must redouble our efforts to build community scale resilience. In this way, I truly believe our planning profession plays an essential role. We can recognize, and we do recognize, and have the ability to address the interconnectedness between systems and build bridges across different fields of expertise, which means we're critical players in this space. We can and must help lead communities towards solutions that build resilience through policy change, programs, and intentional outreach, so that not only are older adults better protected, but so too are people of all ages and all abilities. So let's unpack for a moment what it looks like, what these impacts are on older adults. We've already talked about how disasters are disproportionately impacting older adults in terms of their lives lost, so many lives lost. But disasters impact older adults in other ways too. Even when they survive a climate-fueled event, many older adults take a financial hit when their homes are damaged or destroyed as a result of climate change. For those who own their home and who have most or all of their retirement savings tied up in their home equity, disasters can be devastating. It's hard for anyone to rebound, but particularly difficult for older adults due to their limited access to capital and credit, limited time to rebuild savings, and long timelines for federal relief. Moreover, people who are struggling with cognitive decline or who aren't computer literate may find the administrative burden of accessing disaster relief simply too hard or too complex. Disasters also impact the health of older adults. When roads go down, or when roads are closed, when the power goes down, or transit services interrupted, people in need of regular medical care are unable to access it. When disasters damage a home in ways that create further health risk, like when flooding damage leads to black mold, the impacts on health have a far longer timeline. And when all of those effects are combined with the trauma of experiencing climate-fueled disasters, it's no surprise that the research shows that they lead to worse health outcomes for older adults. Even for those who safely evacuate, either temporarily or permanently, there are health consequences. Again, the disruption of routine, the lack of access to medical care or caregiving, and the trauma of the move can accelerate mental and physical decline. And in this way, climate change becomes a very real threat to being able to successfully age independently in place. I started my research thinking that the greatest risk for older adults was during disasters, but I came to realize that the new normal that we are all learning to adapt to on a near daily basis also has a disproportionate effect on older adults. This risk is particularly acute for those who live with pre-existing health conditions like heart disease or hypertension, respiratory diseases like asthma. And the National Council on Aging estimates that 80% of people over 65 live with 2 or more chronic health conditions. We just finished the hottest summer on record on Earth so far, which of course impacts everyone, but not everyone equally. For the reasons I've just shared, I believe that climate change is wreaking havoc on old adults in a more insidious and complex way. Periods of prolonged heat in particular are deadly for older adults. Extreme heat is now the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the US, killing more than all other weather-related causes combined. Apologies. Heat-related illnesses lead to 12,000 deaths each year, and of those, 80% of the people who die are over 60. We saw this in stark relief in the Pacific Northwest heat waves in 2021, where 1,000 people died. In the most impacted county, the average age was 67. That's because older bodies don't process excess heat the way younger bodies do. Fatigue and weakness from heat exhaustion can be missed because they mimic other conditions, thereby going untreated. We've probably all heard of Eric Klinenberg and the work that he famously did on the importance of social connectedness in his study of fatality rates among older adults during the 1995 Chicago heat wave. For the almost 30% of older adults who live in their homes alone today, that lack of connectedness translates into additional risk. And of course, wildfires and flooding also have an impact. Smoke from fires and black mold found in homes that have been flooded exacerbate respiratory challenges. Dust from drought and fires can increase the risk of heart attack, especially for those who are overweight and diabetic. And it isn't just the health impacts that make climate change more dangerous for older adults. It also exacerbates their often precarious financial conditions in ways that increase their vulnerability. You'll remember that a large and growing share of older adults are already housing cost burdened, both owners and renters. But now with more extreme temperatures, the cost of keeping homes sufficiently cool or warm rises. When we have to run the AC or heater longer, higher utility bills result. There are some resources to fill the gap, like LIHEAP, but they are oversubscribed and insufficient. And this has the greatest effect on low-income, older adult-headed households who already struggle to pay for utilities. AARP reports that nearly 1 in 5 went without basic necessities for at least 1 month to pay an energy bill. Our new normal means that someone suffering in a home or apartment that is too cold or too warm has to make real-time decisions about how much they can afford and how much discomfort they can withstand. And more demand for heating and cooling places a greater strain on the grid, leading to longer and more frequent blackouts. In areas where these are commonplace, and especially for people who need to keep in-home medical equipment operational, still greater costs arise for generators or alternate power sources. In addition, flood and wildfire insurance premiums are increasing as we develop more data-informed projections about risk. FEMA is phasing in those changes, but it still means that homeowners will see premiums increase 18% every year for more than a decade. In real terms, that means that a homeowner in Louisiana will see their flood insurance rates grow from $842 a year to over $5,000. In Florida, from $1,053 per year to over $4,000. I mentioned 3 big takeaways. My second big takeaway, as you'll recall, was that we cannot rely upon individual and institutional preparedness as the solution. Certainly, both individual and institutional preparedness have their place. Each person bears some responsibility to plan for a future with greater risks. And institutions that care for older adults have a moral and often legal responsibility to protect their residents in times of crisis. But the reality is that there are limits to what can be reasonably expected in terms of being prepared for disasters. There are limits to what someone can do to stockpile sufficient food and prescriptions to weather a crisis, especially when they already struggle to make daily ends meet. This is certainly the case for that 15% of Americans over 65 who live at or below the poverty line. For people who live with cognitive decline, dementia, or Alzheimer's, as is the case for 1 in 9 people over 65, there may be very real limitations to their ability to assess risk and take the needed steps to plan for it. And certainly preparedness is a far more complex challenge for people who are caregivers for a spouse, adult child, or older parent, and forced to weigh both individual and collective risks. Many of the stories of older adults who die in disasters tell of people who took some steps to prepare, but were ultimately overwhelmed by the conditions they were confronted with and unable to get the help they needed because the systems were strained. There's also a role for institutional preparedness. One of the somewhat positive legacies of past disaster is a 2016 policy called the Emergency Preparedness Rule that requires that any institution that funded by Medicare or Medicaid prepare for disasters. This is good news for the roughly 4% of older adults who live in congregate facilities, like nursing homes or assisted living, but it too has its limitations. You'll remember that the vast majority of older adults live in the community and that nearly 30% live alone. Of course, some older adults live with and are cared for by a spouse or family, but increasingly older adults are childless. Whereas 11% of people over 75 have no kids, 20% of the younger older adults, age 55 to 64, have no kids. Second, efforts to roll back the requirements of the Emergency Preparedness Rule have led to a patchwork of state enforcement. As a result, some states more stringently enforce the policy and other states take a more hands-off approach, to deadly effect in some cases. In Louisiana, following Hurricane Ida in 2021, 15 people died when they were evacuated from their nursing home to a warehouse in compliance with a plan that met the letter of the law, but nevertheless failed to protect older adults. I hope that you're starting to see now the imperative for my third takeaway, which was that we need to plan better at the community scale. If we are to reduce the impacts of climate change on older adults and account for the limitations of individual and institutional preparedness, we must work, all of us, to build community resilience. And that means thinking differently about resilience, both what constitutes it and who is needed to achieve it. As a planner, thinking about what is needed, naturally my mind goes first to public systems and policies and infrastructure improvements. Things like more hard infrastructure, seawalls and levees to protect communities, more green infrastructure to better manage flooding, and a more resilient grid that can withstand extreme conditions and keep the power. But it also includes more resilient housing construction, all the aspects I spoke of in the first half, especially in age-targeted housing. Resilience would include stronger building codes and zoning reform to create smaller, denser housing that reduces utility consumption and cultivates a social network that can help in times of disaster. Community resilience would also deliver a diverse transportation network that includes public transit and fosters biking and walking to provide safe, affordable, and reliable options for the roughly 1 in 5 people over 65 who don't drive. It would account for shading and seating needs for people relying upon services to ensure that they remain viable in extreme conditions. And community resilience would also include multiple modes of communicating about disasters, keeping in mind the significant share of older adults who aren't internet savvy, or who live with disabilities, or who speak a language other than English. But again, this is not a job just for planners alone. Many more sectors and diverse partnerships are required to work towards this climate resilient future. Some of the partners are ones that we don't traditionally work with in the planning world, but which nonetheless play a critical role in achieving a more resilient future. Utilities, for example, can implement payment systems that lower the seasonal cost spikes that may cause older adults to go without cooling or heating. They can encourage greater energy efficiency in homes and the use of renewable energy and battery storage to provide power when the grid goes down. And they can do a better job of communicating planned power outages, so-called brownouts, that reduce load on the grid in peak times. Healthcare professionals can proactively address the issue of climate change in the course of medical care so that older adults and their caregivers better understand the risks of longer, hotter seasons or poor air quality days, especially as they relate to underlying medical conditions. Home health aides can be trained to help their clients better prepare for climate-related risks and identify interventions in the home that can make them safer, like backup power generators or air purifiers. Healthcare facilities can also more readily use mobile clinics in their practice so that patients who need regular care can get it, even if transportation systems are disrupted. Emergency managers and climate resilience planners can more explicitly incorporate aging in their planning, not just for the older adults who live in facilities, but for the vast majority who live in the community, often alone. They can plug into ongoing age-friendly planning efforts at the local or regional level, and emergency managers can serve as both a resource for and an advocate for better, more risk-informed decisions around housing, transportation, and infrastructure. And finally, aging advocates can recognize that climate change is central to their work. They can educate and train their industry and integrate climate considerations more routinely into how they develop programs and policies to serve the needs of older adults. They can make themselves known to other sectors as experts and establish relationships that cultivate a greater understanding of and consideration for older adults. When these and other disciplines center their work around how to reduce climate change risk for older adults, we create safer and more resilient places for all. I want to very quickly touch on 2 case studies that I cover in more depth in the book, one of which comes from Oregon, where they implemented a practice rooted in an age-friendly plan that had been in place for many years, but uniquely cultivated a partnership between both the city and county, each of which had different levers. At the county, that is where the Area Agency on Aging and the emergency management functions resided. At the city, that is where the housing, transportation, and sustainability levers lived. But through that coordination, and particularly learning from what they saw in COVID, where they needed trusted CBO, community-based organizations on the ground to deliver support during COVID, they translated that same infrastructure into addressing risk between the heat domes that occurred between 21 and 22, using the same set of infrastructure, the same partners to very quickly get portable heat pumps out into the homes of low-income older adults. Second example comes from New Orleans, where they've shifted their climate resilience practice over time from a starting point of needing to evacuate to instead understanding what it means to shelter in place without power for days or weeks on end. They recognize the limitations of institutional preparedness and have begun to cultivate a really strong, decentralized, community-based organization network that not only builds resilience in the community, but also does things like deliver renewable energy through mobile offerings when the power goes down. Many of the solutions that are needed to achieve this future, frankly, are already rooted in the planning toolbox. It starts with good land use practices and principles that seek to make careful use of natural resources. It continues by ground truthing these ideas in the needs of the people who will be most impacted, namely aging people and older adults, And I'll give a nod here for the age-friendly planning framework that the WHO and AARP promulgate as a really great mechanism to do that. The plans, of course, are strengthened even further by data-driven risk assessments. We've never had as many user-friendly tools available at our fingertips as we do now, many of which are found in the Climate Resilience Toolkit hosted by the US government. And these tools allow us to ground our work in actual risks that we'll be facing. Finally, and perhaps obviously, it's really imperative that we recognize that there's the limitations of our reach, and that we enlist partnerships from those well beyond the planning profession, like utilities and aging advocates and others who have critical roles to play in delivering a more resilient future. With that, I will thank you for taking the time to listen and learn about this topic. I really believe that this is a job for all of us, and I think that we can make an impact in how we do our work when we think about the intersection of both climate risk and aging. And I look forward to the questions that you'll throw my way.
All right, great. And boy, do we have all the questions.
And I have no idea what they are because I can't see the chat. So this is great.
That's fine. That's really fine. So they're here.
Okay, cool.
Okay. So we're gonna start here. We're digging in deep right
All right.
away. So this first one, actually, I thought about this too. So thank you, Kirby. Kirby says, I'm curious about electrification of housing. So in Buffalo, people die during a severe snowstorm because their power and electric heat went out. So do you think home level generators connected to gas in case of an emergency might be part of the solution when we're talking about, folks that live in those volatile areas?
I do think that I think a couple of things. One, I think there's lots of different ways to get to decarbonization and electrification. And that doesn't just mean gas-powered generators, but I think there is a role for those, particularly for emergency heat on an emergency heat basis. So I don't think that we'll ever be able to get to fully fossil fuel homes until we solve for this reliability challenge that we've got with the electric grid. So I do think that probably there's a role in the near future for gas powered generators. But I do think there's tons of promise that hasn't yet been fully explored in coupling renewable energy with on-site battery storage. And, I just had solar panels in my house installed this week. I opted not to do the battery storage because it's incredibly expensive. But the reality is that as that technology becomes more frequently used, and particularly if we can create more incentives than even exist in the IRA right now, for people to utilize that, then you create that redundancy and that reliability that I think is going to meet the needs for people in Buffalo, as was asked.
Okay. And do you feel that like the elderly population might naturally live in more volatile areas? So like the example was the Florida coastline, or hey, if you're able to, Hawaii or Southern California, or folks tend to move down south as they get older.
Yeah.
If the winter is too rough.
Absolutely. A couple things. I mean, I think that Climate Central report showed that, coastal population is nearly doubling for people who are over 65. And I would argue, and I think many people would agree, that coastal locations are uniquely vulnerable, particularly with regards to sea level rise and increased storm intensity. But we also see risk in other parts of the country that aren't on the coast. I'm thinking about, the Camp Fire fires, which in Paradise, which were overly populated and disproportionately populated by older adults because they moved up there when they retired. So you move into a more forested area, you're at greater risk. I am disheartened by the reality that, we just went through a summer where Phoenix, I think, endured 6 weeks straight of 100-degree plus weather, maybe 110-degree plus weather. And yet Arizona is one of the fastest growing areas for older adults. So yes, I do think there's a little cognitive dissonance that's happening in terms of beginning to be honest and open-eyed about the risks that people are undertaking in these communities. I think also there's a presumption that services will be there to catch us, that of course there's backup plans in place that will meet our needs. And I think what we're finding is both the frequency of these disasters and just the degree to which the needs are growing more complicated is really stretching the abilities of communities to respond to those needs and provide that safety net. So there's an individual role to be had, making responsible choices about how much risk you're able to endure. But there's also a lot of, I think, misinformation and maybe, um, you know, not honest assessment of what services may or may not be available to support you when you're going to need that help.
Um, could you talk for a moment on manufactured housing and where that plays a role? And I'm glad this person asked this because we actually had a webcast on this very topic. The Pennsylvania chapter hosted it back in the middle of October, and it was manufactured housing impacts and on sustainability and affordability. And if you weren't on that call, like head over to our website now and watch that recording because it was just really interesting, and I feel like it's a crazy missed opportunity. And I know there's a lot of implications with zoning and the NIMBYism and things like that, but I'm telling you, that's an opportunity.
It really is. Hi, Sarah. Great question. Yeah, no, I totally agree. A couple things. I think one, I think we need to be frank about, there are a lot of manufactured homes that are not safe places to live at the moment, right? I personally have a friend who lives in San Jose, and I went to go, she's in her 70s. I visited her this summer and past summer, and she's like, we can't meet, my house is too hot. We have to go to the community room. And I'm like, what? How do you, and that's it's just poorly insulated. It's not designed to meet the post 1970s standards. The other, so that's a risk, and I think that's a challenge. I think ensuring that we are getting older adults out of dangerous homes and keeping them in secure, stable, safe manufactured housing absolutely needs to be part of the solution. The other part of it is that what we're seeing is on the heels of disasters and I'm thinking of wildfires in Colorado, and I want to say it's Estes, but I could be wrong. Also, I've heard this in Southern Oregon. When the fire sweeps through, it's frankly, a lot of times it's hitting manufactured home communities particularly hard. For whatever reason, they're in more vulnerable areas, or just the particular route that the fire takes, or because of other preconditions that might exist. When those are rendered obsolete and people can no longer live there, some communities are taking that as an opportunity to zone them out and say, we don't want this manufactured community to return. And I've heard that in Colorado in particular, where that's yet another risk for older adults, right? Like, it's not already dangerous enough to kind of survive the fire and to try and rebuild. Now you have to actually battle with the locality to ensure that the same amount of land is dedicated to that use as was the case before, when there are market forces that want for that not to be the situation. So yes, I agree with Sarah. I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of need to focus on manufactured home, particularly because of the disproportionate presence of older adults in manufactured homes. It's often the most affordable housing solution. It's a small unit. There's a lot of community benefits that come with it. You're close to your neighbors, but there are risks too.
And can you briefly speak on the standards for manufactured housing and you mentioned the 1970s, and is that the standard still for federal?
I'm going to quickly get out of my depth on this, so I'm afraid of misspeaking, but I will say that the manufactured housing standards are handled altogether differently than standards for stick-built homes. So it's actually a guidance that comes out of HUD. I want to believe that either have updated it recently or in the process of updating it to ensure that manufactured homes are performing at a higher level. What I've heard people say, what I believe to be true, is that they're a very green housing solution in many cases because there's much less waste when built in a factory versus built on site, and that they can be designed in ways that are, highly energy efficient, highly good indoor air quality environments. So there's a lot of good innovation that's happened within the manufactured home industry recently. The challenge, I think, is ensuring that there's adequate land and, frankly, security for people who live in homes in manufactured home communities, so that they don't get, priced out, zoned out, or otherwise displaced.
Thank you. I ask this question often. It's a question that if anyone really knew the answer, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. But so how do we incentivize our developers to come in and build affordable housing? And I guess some of the things, just kind of like taking it down at least, or like putting it into one option, as that's such a large question, is what can we as planners do to incentivize or maybe not even incentivize, but create a simpler path, a less expensive path for developers to move through the process
Mhm.
of, you know, building new homes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the stuff that's in the purview of planners obviously is, I think, land use and permitting, right? So I think that's the stuff that can be simplified, streamlined, green lighted. You can do lots of things to kind of eliminate fees, whether it's
Right.
reduce service charges or expedite permitting, commitments to review permits within the X period of time. All those things are in the land use and the planner's toolbox. There's a whole set of factors outside of planners' purview that affects affordable housing, which I now have the, I guess, benefit of being able to see my colleagues in National Housing Trust struggle with, which is just the complexity of getting the financing in order. And unfortunately, that is not something that planners can do too much about. You can certainly, make it give greater assurances that they won't need to worry about a zoning. They won't need to get a variance to do something that they need to do in order to qualify for the tax credit. So if they need to hit a higher unit level, if you can eliminate the part of the process that requires them to get a variance to hit that number to make the project pencil better, that's something that a planner can manage. But the other thing that localities, I'll say more generally, can do, and states more generally can do, is just to really prioritize new sources of funding for affordable housing. It is the reason that we have an affordable housing crisis is because it costs more to build a home than we can recover in rents. It's a market gap, and it needs to be filled by the public sector. That's frankly the only way we're going to get there. And so I think cultivating an understanding of how we identify resources to fill that gap is really important. I'm a big believer, big proponent in loosening up zoning restrictions so you can build more multifamily, so it's more by right, so people can put ADUs in their backyard, so you can convert a house into a triplex. All of those things will help, but you need to still couple that with public resources if you want it to be truly affordable for 60% AMI and below. We're just not going to sort of magically, or even in the near term or medium term, get to truly affordable levels through zoning alone. So there's a public financing element to it as well.
So when I start hearing about public financing and all of that, I do this because I did it. Like I did it in grad school, but I do this.
Yeah.
And let's just say, that I am a public planner and I have a staff of me or a staff of two, and we have a huge issue. We know we have an issue. It's there. Do we like find a consultant to come in and help us find the funds to attract the developers? Like, are there, so there's national organizations. Does every state have someone that you can go to and say, help, we're a small community and we need all the funds and we need to help developers, get in here and do the things?
Yeah.
What do they do?
I think it's a couple different things. I think on the one hand, yes, I think there's a cultivation of a developer ecosystem that can occur, right? And that means making it easier for smaller firms to be competitive for public resources. Or I will say securing tax credits is it is an incredibly complex field, and I think there's a real expertise that goes into understanding how to put a deal together to get those tax credits. And that is the thing that people need. I mean, our developers, you have to go through 1, 2, 3 cycles, sometimes 3 years to wait to get those tax credits before you can start the deal. So the competitive nature and the oversubscribed nature of tax credits is a huge challenge, and that's very daunting for a new developer who's trying to get this done. So I think in the meantime, you can bring new developers online, match them with more experienced developers, have more flexible pools of funding available, revolving loan funds and things like that can get development deals going. At the same time, there is a real need to preserve the existing affordable housing stock. I think one of the blind spots that we have as a country is that we focus so much on supply and the need to build new without recognizing that we're actually hemorrhaging existing affordable housing now. So whether it's existing multifamily buildings that can be that maybe naturally occurring affordable housing needs are not subsidized at present, how might a community land trust be brought in, or another public entity, a community development corporation, come in to retain, to get ownership of that property, who has the commitment to keep it affordable in the long term. I do think cultivating like the community land trust network is incredibly important, just in terms of bringing down the cost of housing as a whole. So it's all those other community-based actors, I think, that can be useful in preserving the existing housing stock that you've got as well. And then, yes, I would say National Housing Trust, we do work with communities oftentimes to help kind of unpack and assess how they can tackle their affordable housing challenges.
Sure. And it was a good segue, because there is a question, and it says, how or can you discuss ways that smaller landlords or even a community who recognizes a lot of either for sale or even rental properties that need upgraded in order to be safe and, to be able to rent out at an affordable rate. So the question is, are there grants that just even landlords or property owners can get access to make substantial upgrades, so that they can rent them out affordably?
Yeah, I will say that the sort of the question of how to get non-subsidized, naturally occurring affordable housing connected to resources to upgrade the property is challenging, because that's the public sphere at present really prioritizes places where there's already a public subsidy. How do you then incentivize those owners to maintain that property at a higher quality? So that's kind of almost like the top tier of like, if you already have some public subsidy in there, we don't want to lose that property, we want to keep it affordable. That's going to be the sort of the first bucket of thinking about how to preserve and upgrade the property. But if it's a naturally occurring affordable property, if it's a privately owned property that has no public subsidy in it, and the owner's looking for help and resources to upgrade the property, that's a perfect opportunity, I think, for the locality to step in and say, we can offer you a property tax abatement if you lock in affordability for 10 years. We can offer you, access to, we can help you get some of these rebates to put heat pumps in all your units, or to think about investing in renewable energy if you agree to affordability over the medium term or the long term. Having a public entity or a nonprofit entity in place to kind of drive that affordability requirement is essential, because without that, the vast majority of owners will kind of float as the rent market does, and will raise rents to maximize profits.
This is an interesting question. So the question is, building and designing for children and disabled populations, is that a lot like, is that an appropriate strategy to also follow when you are trying to provide infrastructure for older adults? So not can you put them all in the same pool, but are the same type of resources or ways in which you approach the social, community, environmental, like all of those aspects, can you kind of look at them the same?
I think there's some overlap. It's like a Venn diagram, right? Where some of the issues that are confronting older adults are also going to be solved well by thinking about people with disabilities or children. Things like, how do you provide more benches in parks? How do you think about housing stock that is more uses more universal design standards or accessibility standards? I think, however, there's what I would caution is that I guess I should say it depends on what is your objective. Is your objective just to allow them to access home and be able to sort of remain mobile in it, or are you trying to solve this climate risk challenge? Because I do think that there ends up being kind of a fundamental parting of the ways when you think about climate risks for children versus older adults. It's not that children don't have asthma. Of course, we know they do. It's not that, there aren't children that live with chronic conditions. Of course there are. But there are also, adults in the mix there who are responsible and who presumably live with a different set of characteristics and making decisions on behalf of that child. The older adult sometimes is the only person. There is no other person sometimes making decisions on behalf of that. And as I don't want to say it's like this across the board, because there's some cultures in the United States and around the world that are much more sort of prioritize elders much more and
sure.
kind of position them in a place of greater respect and centeredness, but it's really shocking and frankly sad to see how many older adults are left to fend for themselves. And so I wouldn't want to equate children and older adults in that way, but I think the reality is that some of the solutions that can address the needs of children and people with disabilities also serve older adults and vice versa. I personally think that, by centering approaches in the needs of older adults, you really do start to unlock a lot of solutions that address the needs of people with disabilities, address the needs of people who are low income, address the needs of people who don't drive, for lots of reasons, economic, other reasons. You start to address the needs of children too. So centering those questions in the needs of older adults is a good way to get there.
Thank you. This next question, I don't know. I personally feel like it's a slippery slope, and I'm not sure. Maybe it is a thing. But can you try to prioritize offering affordable housing to the people that already live in your community versus people coming in from the outside and it becoming sort of like, oh, you should move to blank, they have affordable housing?
Yeah.
Talk about all that.
It's hard because you trigger fair housing rules real quickly. Like, I think there's a way to do it a little bit through community benefit agreements, if I'm not mistaken. I think that is a way where when the locality is negotiating with the developer and the developer is asked to generate benefits for the community, part of that can be, we will offer units to X percent of, or X percent of units to residents of this particular area. I think that is a way that can work, but you can't say we're developing, a brand new community of missing middle housing and it's only for people who've lived in Bozeman for 10 years or something, because we don't want all those newcomers to access it. It's really challenging. Yeah. I guess the only thing I'd say about that too is, like, I do think that things like accessory dwelling units, it is a way for people who already live in the property, in the community, to benefit from that housing stock growth. Like, if you're creating ways for existing residents to capitalize on the increased demand for housing, then that can be a way of also, lifting the boats, if you will, for people who already live in the community.
I think we'll do 2 more questions. How about that?
Sounds good.
This one, let's talk about water scarcity for a moment. Where does it come into play? I know we've talked a little bit about this, but the question says the cost of water development fees and rates continues to increase, and large areas of the U.S. are reliant on an over allocated water resource that will impact community resiliency. So can we just dive a little more into that?
Yeah, to the degree that I can, and I'll quickly hit the depths of what I know, which is not much, but I do know enough to say yes, she's absolutely right. Mariel's absolutely right. I mean, I was somewhat heartened. I think we started to talk about this earlier. I was somewhat heartened that Phoenix actually began to tie development decisions to the availability of water, only to see a story, I think yesterday, that now there are private water vendors who are coming in and looking to bypass the development freeze, if you will, because they can meet that need through another mechanism. It just reflects this utter lack of desire or willingness on the part of some actors to look at the bigger picture and to understand that these are unsustainable choices that we are making as a country. I come from California, part of California, where in Monterey, nearby Monterey, Carmel, they limit development because of water access, and that becomes a real trigger for new development. Drives up costs, it limits growth, which is exactly not the thing you need right now in California, where we need more housing solutions. But it is definitely a challenge, and I totally agree that we've over allocated our water supply, and we have a good year this year in the West, but it's not necessarily going to be that way in the future. So we need to start planning accordingly.
Yeah, I'm going to end on this question. How do we balance prioritizing production of inclusionary housing over preservation of natural lands in communities where infill development or redevelopment is politically or economically challenging? So it's just a whole other level of confusion and walls
Yeah.
hit when it comes to this. But
Yeah. So like
valid, I guess,
this is
you know.
this is the question that I feel like I began wondering about my first day at EPA in the year 2000. Like when I started working there.
You're
like,
still thinking about it, aren't you?
yeah, exactly. We haven't solved it. Go figure.
Right?
But I do, you know what I guess one thing I would say is like what I've learned is that people aren't necessarily going to be compelled by um, a an argument that increasing density is good for them because it saves natural space. I don't think people connect the dots on that. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. They think, I don't want my community changed. People can always drive farther out. That's not my problem. Let the market be the market. What I have found is that being able to bring aging and community into the equation is a way of kind of inviting a different conversation. So you can still get to infill development and redevelopment by saying, we want people to age in place. People value the community where they live. Right now, there are very few options to move. We were just talking to Christine at the top of the hour about that. Few options that your parents have. How do you create an option so someone who's lived all their life in a split level home, in a single family detached neighborhood, has something other to move into, other than a retirement community or a nursing home? You want to be able to offer options in the existing community, in the neighborhood that people know and love. And I think that can be a way to open the door to redevelopment conversations and infill development in ways that feel a little bit less threatening. You're still getting the same outcome. If you can concentrate development in existing neighborhoods, you're still saving and preserving natural lands and protecting the functions that they deliver, but you're just not leading with that foot. You're leading with, how do we create options for people in communities that they already love to live in? And how do you create options for your children who are graduating from college to come back and live near you when right now the housing supply doesn't allow for that? Like, it's taking a different tack at the same challenge.
Oh, I'm following my kids wherever they go.
Yeah.
Like, they know this. If they don't come back to us, we're packing up and moving
There you
wherever
go.
they go.
Easy peasy.
I'll stay in the car.
Yeah.
This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks.
And obviously we didn't solve the world's problems, but honestly it gives us a lot to think about in moving the needle forward.
Yeah.
And this was just a really good conversation.
Thank you
And
so
I
much.
appreciate you coming on and joining us.
Yeah.
And to the Virginia chapter of EPA for hosting this session today. Just a couple quick logistic things before everyone signs off. We are recording this. There were quite a few questions about that, and we'll post it. I'll have it up on Monday on our YouTube channel. So youtube.com/planning webcast. That's where this will be. And if you have any further questions, just go ahead and email me, and I can either forward it out or get your contact information over to Danielle if you need it. Don't forget to log your CM credits. If you need any kind of proof for your continuing education that's not AICP CM, just email me and I can get you a certificate. And don't forget to register for our last session at the beginning of December. So, hey, we are not on next week, everyone. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you are celebrating, and everyone have a good weekend, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody.
I'm loving all the thumbs up.
I know,
Thanks, everybody.
right?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.